Political Insider. I'm Brett Smith, your humble host, and joining me today is John Odermatt. John is a libertarian political commentator and the host of Finding Freedom on the Lions of Liberty Network. John's show takes a deep look at the problems within the criminal justice system, how individuals can achieve greater freedom in their life, and much more. He's coming to us now from Pennsylvania, which is one of the most critical states to watch this midterm election. John, thanks for being here.
Brett, thanks for having me on the show, and I am looking forward to talking about this Fetterman-Dr. Oz race.
And this is one of the craziest races I think I've ever seen. The Senate race in Pennsylvania has caught the attention, I think, of the nation at this point. On one hand, you have Democrat John Fetterman, clearly pushing an ultra-left agenda. He's clearly mentally and physically unfit to serve, really, in any office at this point. I think that's pretty clear. Then you have Dr. Oz, who's largely criticized by conservatives for being wishy-washy on issues ranging from vaccines to abortion and gun rights. As an independent voter, when you saw these two on the general election ballot, what were your first thoughts?
I think I threw up in my mouth a little bit. But, with I guess to start with Dr. Oz, and, from a personal standpoint, from watching him on television, I never really had a big issue with the guy. But once he shows up on a ballot and he's going to be potentially serving as your state senator, you start to look a little more closely. And you mentioned at the top there, very wishy-washy on gun rights. Yes. Also, in the past, on his TV show, did some things with bringing transgender children and also transgender surgeons on his show to give them a platform. Since then, he has kind of changed his stance on that, saying that he's not in favor of males participating in female sports and things like that. You have to take him at his word for something like that. But of course, was not really excited for him to be the Republican nominee for Senate. In the primary, I don't know if your listeners or your watchers remember this, but in the GOP primary in PA for that seat, very close race. There was, I think they did a recount in every single county in Pennsylvania between Dr. Oz and David McCormick. David McCormick, a former hedge fund CEO, right. Very, very qualified. I think a West Point graduate, I believe. Don't have that in front of me. But extremely close. Kind of surprising that Trump endorsed Dr. Oz. I think that shocked a lot of people. But he did, and that really gave him enough steam to get over top. And I think from the start, Oz was in a position where, with it being such a contested primary race, that he had to kind of find a way to unite the GOP behind him, or his campaign team did, and they just had an awful start to doing that. One of the worst run campaigns from going from after the primary through the first few months of the general, just getting destroyed by Fetterman. Fetterman, just having had a stroke right before the primary, was totally missing from the scene. No interviews, no appearances, nothing. And Fetterman's team would lay into Oz, and Oz would put out goofy videos and goofy commercials and just get destroyed without any rebuttal or any aggression back towards attacking John Fetterman. To switch to Fetterman, I've known this guy for, not known him personally, but known of him for a while. I live in Western Pennsylvania. He has been the mayor of Braddock, which is just outside of Pittsburgh. I think he was the mayor for something like 12 or 13 years. And a lot of people who look at John Fetterman from the outside, they look at him and they think, oh, he must be, sort of a man of the people, a blue collar man. He looks like, if you envision like what Pittsburgh looks like, you look at John Fetterman, you think that guy looks like Pittsburgh, kind of. So he kind of has that going for him, right? But in reality, when you peel back the layers, he's a guy that grew up in a very privileged life. Parents, very successful conservative Republicans growing up in York.
Really?
And I think his dad had an insurance agency. But yeah, so he grew up with that, and his parents actually supported him most of his life. I think till he was like 49 or maybe even later than that, but, buying his houses, and even when he was mayor of Braddock, helping him to invest in the community there. And I think he bought a church and turned it into a community center with their backing. But he's really made a political career out of dressing up like a blue collar worker, and it's fooled people. And I think it's interesting that he doesn't talk about his parents or the success of his parents achieving the American dream, really enabling him to live this life. Instead, he's gone that, Bernie Sanders route where he wants to use the government to funnel money into pet projects and different things that he wants to address, rather than Fetterman could have taken the route of his father, become successful, and done the same thing through charity. So I think it's very interesting dynamic.
Since the recent debate, which showed Fetterman's concerning health issues, Dr. Oz has for the first time surpassed him in polling among likely voters. How's it taken people this long to see that Fetterman isn't fit to be a candidate? And what are you hearing from Democrats' messaging in your state? And does it look like people are finally taking his mental and physical state seriously?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And, living in Pennsylvania, I obviously watched that entire debate. It was brutal. It was painful to watch. Honestly, I felt bad for John Fetterman during the debate, just because he was a guy in that mental state, recovering from a stroke, should not be in that position. And, you could blame his family. You could blame the Democrat Party in Pennsylvania for keeping him on the ballot, but he should not be in that position. And, the Democrats tried to turn that into, well, look at him, put him on a pedestal. He's recovering from a stroke and he's fighting through it. He's not fit to serve. And I think that was the first time a lot of voters in Pennsylvania actually saw John Fetterman post-stroke. The media has done a very good job of hiding him. You'll see clips from his rallies, and no matter what part of the state he's in, you'll see a clip where it's just like one sentence, and they won't air anything. But you go on Twitter or you go on, digging through the interwebs, and you can dig up the entire speech, and it's just incoherent nonsense with that one line just kind of pulled out. I think honestly, a lot of true blue Democrats didn't change a thing. They're still going to vote for Fetterman because they're not going to vote for Oz, and they think Oz is Hitler, just like they think pretty much every Republican is Hitler. I think where it's going to change it is with independents, with libertarians like myself, who and I'm a libertarian who typically, before, I would say, this election really, I was voting almost exclusively libertarian. What's changed in that, the main thing that changed it for me. And I shouldn't say the main thing. It's really COVID and all kinds of stuff. But the trigger point when I was like, you know what, I don't care, I'm voting for the Republicans in Pennsylvania in this race, was that Joe Biden speech where he gave the speech with the red background, and he was basically calling every Republican a neo-Nazi. I'm like, whoa, hold on a second here. This is an attack. If he thinks Republicans are Nazis, what does he think of libertarians? What does this administration think of libertarians? I'm like, this is self-defense at this point, right?
Great
so
point.
Yeah, I don't know if people are waking up in the one poll that you sent along. There's a really telling quote in there, which I want to read, that talks about the difference between the people who saw the debate and who didn't, and how they are going to vote. Of those who saw the debate, Oz leads Fetterman 55% to 41%. Of those who either just saw pieces of it or know nothing about the debate, Fetterman leads 56 to 28. So, I mean, that really tells you a lot about the state of our democracy. And it's probably a larger percentage than we're comfortable with that really have no knowledge of the debate, have no knowledge of Fetterman's health, and are just going to vote for him because he's pro-union and he's a Democrat.
Yeah, it reminds me of Gabby Giffords. They're going to put his wife in. He's going to step down. There's no way he stays in there. I just don't see it. While this race has largely been reduced to a contest of whether voters nationwide want Republicans to take back the Senate or Democrats to maintain their majority, what do Pennsylvanians actually want? What don't people outside of Pennsylvania know about the priorities of what Pennsylvania voters want out of their next U.S. senator?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about Pennsylvania from people who don't live in the state, much like any state, I think. Unless you live in that state and you understand the dynamics, I think it's hard to understand the politics. But Pennsylvania is essentially Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Kentucky or Alabama in the middle. You have extremely rural areas, people who just want to be left alone, very, very libertarian, very, very, very conservative beliefs that don't want the government infringing upon their life. And then you have in Philly and Pittsburgh, more so in Philly just because it's so massive, you have more of that urban voter that are gonna that they're pretty much gonna vote Democrat no matter what. Now, what really swings this state? Yes, it's the independent voters, but I think a piece of that, where a lot of those independent voters are, or a lot of those voters who they might be registered Democrat, but swing back and forth and vote Republican sometimes. You have it in the belts around Pittsburgh and around Philadelphia of suburbia. And what you had in 2016, you had a lot of those suburbs, a lot of those areas go for Donald Trump. In 2020, you had a lot of those areas go for Joe Biden. And what it's going to come down to, I think, is inflation. I think everybody's talking about inflation. Even people on the left are starting to stop their denial of inflation being a real thing because they're noticing there's not as much money in my bank. What is happening here? Then they start looking at the money that's going out and how much they're spending and everything. A couple of the other things, abortion, obviously, that's a piece. Democrats have been hammering that. I don't think that's going to, it's when they rank issues, it's like normally coming in like 2 or 3, but it's going to be important. Abortion is important to a lot of people, for Democrats to protect that right, and of course for Republicans to keep that at the state level and not have a federal. Some sort of federal monstrosity go through regulating abortion. But I think really the one thing that a lot of people aren't looking at that will have a big impact on this election is children and their education. And if, we want them to be forcibly vaccinated with the COVID vaccine, that's something that's really not being talked about. And I think that will sway a lot of soccer moms voting. We've seen recently, I think it was in Michigan with Gretchen Whitmer, who was her opponent Dixon. I forget her first name.
Tudor. Yeah.
Is it Tudor Dixon?
Yeah,
I think it's
Tudor
Tudor Dixon.
Yep.
She was citing a constituent that she talked to, a Muslim guy who really was talking about, I've been a Democrat my whole life, but because of what's happening in the schools, and then bringing sex into the schools, teaching kindergartners about transgenderism and sex education, I'm voting Republican. All of my Muslim friends are voting Republican. That same thing, not necessarily with the religious background, but that same thing with conservative soccer moms who might not be conservative in that they're going to vote Republican, but conservative in that they don't want their children in kindergarten or first grade learning about sex. They're going to vote Republican to protect their kids. When you put kids on the ballot, that's going to change a lot of votes and change how people vote. And we'll talk about predictions in a minute, but I'll hold off without saying anything else at this point, I guess.
Okay, so final question. What are your ultimate predictions for the election outcomes across the board?
Yeah, I've been watching, this election obviously closely, and this time I'm kind of a political junkie, so this part of the year I get probably unhealthily obsessed with looking at polls and, historically looking at trends with polls. And, things have obviously, I think even someone who's not looking at that closely have seen things really drastically move in the Republican direction. And there's always undercounting too with Republican voters, especially when you look at Pennsylvania, I think, with a governor candidate like Doug Mastriano, who has been completely blacked out by the media and has been called a Nazi and every name in the book and lumped in with Trump. Who was there on January 6th and, of course, is an insurrectionist because he attended the rally on January 6th. So you have that dynamic with a GOP candidate on the ballot who's lumped in with Trump. He's been his polling has been not even showing him close to the Democrat Shapiro. I think the closest I saw actually was a poll today from I forget the name of the polling agency. Trafalgar, is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Trafalgar. And I think they had it like at 4 or 5, which is the closest I've seen that. It's been like 10 or 15 for most of the past couple months. Oz now has, he's sort of cut ahead of Fetterman by, 2 or 3 points in a lot of recent polls. And I think at the end of the day, I think you will see really the Oz vote sort of pull that governor race closer than these polls are showing. I don't know if Mastriano is going to beat Shapiro, but I think it's going to be a lot closer than people think. And I do think Dr. Oz is going to win by, he's not going to blow out Fetterman, but I think he'll win by 3 or 4 percentage points, honestly. And it's going to be that It's going to be people voting to protect their kids. That's what's going to happen at this point. And the polls don't capture that. They just don't. I participated in my first poll via text message this year. They finally contacted me. And, after going through the whole process, answering all the questions, I was like, I don't want to do that again. That sucked. That was a waste of time. So people my age and people who are busy, and people who have lives and kids and jobs, they don't want to do these polls, especially when you're calling one of the Republican, the candidate for governor, when the media is openly calling him a Nazi. Do you want to openly support him or support Dr. Oz, who's running, on the same GOP ballot with him? So I think it's just... It could be closer than that, but I do think that Dr. Oz will beat Fetterman.
Well, sadly, we're out of time. John, give everyone your social media coordinates so they know where to find you and your work.
Sure. You can find my podcast. We are on the Lions of Liberty Network. My show is called Finding Freedom. So you can find it on the Lions of Liberty Network or just by searching Finding Freedom and my name. You can find me on Twitter at John Odermatt. Odermatt is spelled Odermatt.
All right. Thanks again, man. Really appreciate it.